On November 20th, Promoting Enduring Peace will be holding its annual Shafer Lecture. From London, the speaker will be Christopher Sebastian. He's a technical writer, journalist, a researcher who writes about the intersections of food, politics, pop culture, and media. He lives in New York City and Prague. He lectures on speciesism at Columbia University and is a board member of Peace Advocacy Network. Good afternoon, Christopher.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you've asked that the topic of your lecture be "The Revolution Will Be Plant-Based," and I'll ask you about that briefly at the end of our interview. But if I may, I wanted to know about you, about how your ideas develop, and more about your life, at least to the start here. Where did you grow up?
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I grew up in North Carolina, a really large family. And so I am, if not by birth, then by my experience, a Southern boy. And I have been involved in Black liberation, or have been talking about Black liberation for a really long time. And much later in life, I was introduced to animal liberation and the importance of it, and the relevance of it to Black liberation struggles.
Now, vegan is an important part of this discussion. Maybe we could start with a definition. I think most of our viewers know it, but a bunch don't. So what does vegan mean?
Yeah, most people usually think of vegan as a way of eating or a diet choice. And that's one definition of being a vegan, just like removing animal products from your diet and minimizing or eliminating the consumption of animal products, which would include everything from meat to milk and dairy products to eggs and honey. But like a more expansive understanding of veganism is the practice of anti-speciesism, which is understood as the bigotry that is experienced by animals from other humans.
Now, was your family vegan or vegetarian?
My family was not vegan or vegetarian. Everyone largely in my family is a meat eater. And I was myself first introduced to veganism in 2004.
So that's not that long ago. I can't do the math in my head. 17 years. And
that's right.
Where and how were you introduced? What
Well, it's really interesting. Yeah, my first exposure to veganism that I can recall is like it actually was returning from a business trip to Las Vegas. I was actually in an airport in Phoenix on a layover headed back to Philadelphia. And I had picked up a book that I thought was a diet book, and it was called Skinny Bitch. And it was, of course, like not a very not a very like feminist or intersectional feminist like book to be reading at the time, but it seemed like a book that was framed around like weight loss. And when I started reading it, I actually came to understand that that the treatment of other animals, not just in our food system, but like the use of animals for entertainment, for experimentation, was absolutely abhorrent. And by the time I landed, I had I was completely vegan. And thankfully I was returning from a trip, so I didn't have much food to throw away in my refrigerator. But I had started to learn how to eat different things and incorporate the understanding that this violence was inherent in our food system into like all aspects of my life.
How did that go along with your family? How did they react to you?
Very, very supportive on an individual level, but not so willing to adopt those practices themselves. So it was one of those things where this is very nice for you, but not so much for the rest of us. Of course, this was like it wasn't ideal for me, because I would prefer that like my family was like actively supportive, but by this time I wasn't living in North Carolina and I wasn't really surrounded by family members. So it didn't matter that much to to me, not having a physical family support system like in my life around me.
So going back to that book, I mean, one book really had a huge influence. Who wrote that book?
I don't even remember the authors of that book, because like although that book itself had a huge influence, it wasn't until years later that that I actively started getting into the politics of veganism and of and of animal liberation activism, because I read the book The Sexual Politics of Meat, written by Carol Adams. And this ecofeminist understanding of of animal liberation and of the practice of veganism is actually what framed my own politics, because that is what had sort of catapulted me into this interrogation of of if Carol Adams had done this expansive and almost exhaustive feminist framing, what were the radical politics of animal liberation in relation to Black liberation. And so I wanted to do a racial exploration. And so that had started me down an academic path that, that for me has been an absolute roller coaster, and one that I found immeasurably fulfilling. And I'm really grateful to to her for that, and for her scholarship, and for the scholarship of all of the people that have already been doing this work for decades before I even realized it.
Who are some of the other people whose books you read or you've met who've really influenced you?
Well, one of the one of the primary books that I had read after Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat was The Dreaded Comparison, which was written by Marjorie Spiegel. And The Dreaded Comparison, of course, is an academic book that lays bare the realities of the ways that we have historically and presently treated animals, and the transatlantic slave trade, and how our treatment of enslaved African people is related to our treatment of animals. And it is this extraordinarily scalpel-like precise exploration of that uses visualizations, that uses historical texts, and and a lot of really graphic and in some cases emotionally confronting language that that really made me aware of the ways that the ways that whiteness and white supremacy and the influences of colonization have have transformed our relationships with other animals in a meaningful way. That was one of the first books, but in looking at the history of the food system, because so much of veganism focuses on food, it how it's not just built on animal exploitation but human exploitation as well, made me realize that this is these are overlapping and intersecting things that cannot be explored individually or in a compartmentalized fashion. It made me really want to understand this holistically, and all of the policy decisions and all of the cultural and social and economic drivers that have created this system in which animals are oppressed, and also Black people and brown people, particularly in the United States, have experienced oppressions that that are all drawn on, or that all draw on the same well of influences. And so much of it is rooted in white supremacist institutions.
So you've written about this and you've lectured all over. Maybe you can tell us some of the places where you've spoken. Have you been involved in campaigns, protests, something like that, where veganism and Black liberation intersect?
Most of my work is academic. Most of my work actually occurs in the classroom instead of on the street. So a lot of that is about a lot of my work is about exploring this from the academic perspective and uncovering the history and making people aware that like our decisions, our food decisions, our like, you know, our entertainment decisions don't occur in a bubble. And so yeah, like I've lectured about this at Columbia. I have lectured about this at Cornell, at Oxford University, the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, like so many places, and like, you know, and making new discoveries along the way. So there's a tremendous body of work to draw on, not just my own discoveries, but the discoveries of other people.
Well, I don't want to preempt, I don't know what the word would be, but let's just touch about the topic. Your lecture is going to be 2 p.m. Eastern on November 20th. It'll be online. What do you mean, briefly, by saying the revolution will be plant-based?
It is a play on the popular phrase that the revolution will not be televised. But yeah, like the revolution will be plant-based, and I very strongly believe that that so much revolutionary thought overlooks, as so much revolutionary thought, so much radical thought, or what we consider to be radical thought, overlooks the ways that we treat animals, the ways that we enact violence against other animals, who are meaningfully minoritized persons in our society, in the ways that they are discriminated against, or like, you know, or treated within our systems. And so, like, you know, when I say that the revolution will be plant-based, I'm talking about, like, you know, just radically changing our food system, radically changing our relationships with other animals, radically changing the way that we think of communities, and the fact that they are all human-centered and oftentimes reproduce the same types of oppression that we are seeking to end, because it maintains the hierarchy that that overvalues or values at all human exceptionalism, because we are just one species of animal on this planet, and we somehow have gotten like the impression that we are the most important species. And that attitude has, like, you know, that has contributed to so much violence. And indeed, it is continuing to contribute to ecological collapse. And until we actually understand our place in this world, until we actually learn how to meditate on our treatment of other animals, I think that it is incredibly, incredibly difficult for us to realistically, like, you know, like end these systems of oppression that, like, you know, that are all around us at all times. And one of the most meaningful steps that we can take in order to, like, you know, in order to practice anti-speciesism is to, number one, adopt a plant-based diet, but really, like, you know, repair our ecological relationships with one another. And so, yeah, like that is what I mean when I say that the revolution will be plant-based.
Sounds very interesting. Looking forward to the talk. Well, thank you for this interview.
Thank you so much.
And for more about Christopher Sebastian, viewers should go to the website of Promoting Enduring Peace, peace.org, where you'll find links to some of his talks and to his personal website. Thank you all for viewing.